Hi, this is the TR-6S, the baby brother to Roland's TR-8S. It has the same exact sound engine, only 6 tracks instead of 11, fewer hands-on controls, and fewer inputs and outputs. But it is more portable because it can be battery powered and takes up less space, and it's less expensive. We'll start this video by comparing the two for the sake of those familiar with the TR-8S. Along the way, we'll learn, of course, what this can do compared to the MC-101. Take a look at some pros and cons. Before I start, a word about what makes these two special. Both the 8S and the 6S are based around the concept of drum synthesis, along with sample playback, as opposed to drum machines that can only play back samples. The MC-101 is a groove box that can play back drum samples, and it has the Zencore engine. We'll talk about that later, but for now, let's just focus on these two. Drum synths typically don't change their fidelity when you pitch them up and down. They do it very naturally, unlike samples that when you pitch them high are very chipmunky, or when you pitch them low they get very long. Aside from pitch, drum synth based sounds can change their character pretty dramatically, something that you can't do. The core essence of a sample stays the same. The 8S and 6S contain two kinds of drum synths: virtual analog models designed to emulate the sounds of Roland's classics, including the 808 and 909. So that's an 808 kit and say a 606 kit, which is also a fully analog synth. And alongside the virtual analog synths, there's a whole bunch of FM synthesis-based sounds, which can sound very interesting and aggressive. And you can morph them as well. You can change their character pretty dramatically. We won't go over all of these, of course. Both have the same FM synth. It's not just for percussive-based sounds, also for tonal sounds, which with FM can sound very interesting. Anyway, the sound engine in both of these is exactly the same thing: analog modeling, FM engine, and samples. So let's take a look at the differences. The first obvious one is the number of tracks. You've got 6 tracks here and 11 tracks here. On the input and output side, there's also a big difference. There are no external inputs on the 6S except the USB, which can transfer audio, and no independent audio outputs or trigger outputs, as opposed to the 8S, which has quite a few of them. The 6S, like the 8S, has MIDI in and out, 5-pin MIDI DIN, and 2 1/4-inch outputs. Both of them have an SD card slot in the back for importing samples and for backing up your projects. Pros for the 6S, however, are that it can be USB powered as well as battery powered by 4 AA batteries, and not only that, it has a 3.5mm headphone jack in the front as opposed to a 1/4-inch one in the back. Other than the inputs and outputs, both can pretty much do the same things. It's just that the 6S is about 1/4 the size, so many of the knobs and buttons are shared, though I have to say they managed quite nicely with this. First, let's take a look at the knobs. So obviously here, every one of the 11 tracks gets 3 dedicated knobs: tune, decay, and a control knob, which is assignable to multiple parameters. Here you've got only one set of these knobs, so you need to select what you want to control, say the bass drum, and then you can determine its tune, its decay, and change whatever the control is assigned to. What this can control, by the way, changes based on the instrument, whether it's an analog model, an FM synth, or a sample. You turn this knob to figure that out. So for FM synths, you've got these parameters, including the morph parameter, which changes the sound quite dramatically, as you heard. Some of the FM sounds have coarse tuning, so you can play them chromatically, and some don't. The virtual analog sounds also have different parameters you can control, and that can change also based on what you load up. So let's say go for, say the 606 bass. Turn this, you can see these are the parameters, and you have an attack parameter here for the control knob, alongside decay and tune. Then finally, for the sample-based instruments, and we'll look for S here, there are a few other parameters that you can control, like a filter and hold and a bunch of other things. We won't get into this. So a little bit more flexibility for the control knob for sample-based instruments. The 8S also has dedicated effects knobs on top. You don't get that here. You need to turn off the drums, and then you've got control over reverb levels, delay levels and the master effect control. Same deal here for reverb, delay, and the master effects. You've got on-panel controls for time and feedback on the 8S. You can't control those two parameters here from these knobs. You can get into a menu and control that. You also can't automate these two parameters on the 6S. Other than that, you can automate any of the knobs on any of the tracks, so sort of the virtual knobs on a per track basis for these three knobs, as well as these when they act as effects knobs. Same deal for accent, no dedicated controls. Accent is an emphasis on a particular step in your pattern. You access that here using these two buttons. There's a hint for it here, and by holding instrument. That's, I think, the only not obvious shift function here. You hold instrument and then press these two, and then you can set accent steps, the emphasized steps, and you set the accent level using the tune knob while you're holding this. Other differences, the 6S doesn't get its own pressure sensitive pad, and even though the sensitivity of this pad wasn't that great, it's certainly better to have it than not. You can still trigger the instruments on the 6S manually, either in instrument record or instrument play mode, just without velocity sensitivity. I won't go through everything, but I think you're starting to get the idea. Everything here is available here, only in a more condensed form. So tempo and shuffle get their own knobs. Here, these are buttons, and you change them using this value encoder. The variation buttons obviously are also important. Each pattern has 8 variations, 16 steps each, and the ability to move through them is obviously important. And you can also chain patterns or variations if you like by pressing one and holding the others. So this is a nice hands-on function in the 8S. Anyway, here there are no dedicated variation buttons, but you press variation and you get the up to 8 variations here. So I could choose to play just one variation or chain a few. So it's here. You just don't get dedicated buttons. There's one small thing that's missing here and exists here, and that is the mixer view. When you hit Shift and Control Select, this gives you a nice overview of what's going on in all your tracks. I couldn't imagine that it would be too hard to add that here. Anyway, those are the big differences. Sequencing is very similar on both. Let's just look at that workflow very briefly for the 6S. Let's start up maybe with a brand new pattern and load up, classic 808 kit is fine. So you can sequence TR style, which means, yes, we'll do this. Very straightforward. You can also play any of the instruments live. So if I hit instrument record and say I wanted to play my snare drum, drums are quantized. If we go into the snare drum, we can fix that if we want. You've got support for ratchets and flams. So you press the sub button, choose the sub or ratchet you want, and add that in, as well as flams. Let's add one here. And there's support for automation. So let's say if I put all these hi-hats in and they sound too monotonous, I can go into Shift Variation, which is motion. That's what automation is called here. Then go into Instrument Record, and I can automate any one of these parameters. You'll see this little M here. That means that there's automation. If I wanted, I could automate tune, or whatever the control is controlling, which I could change here. So if you go for reverb send, and I will need to increase my reverb for that. And since we don't want a reverb send on the other tracks, which by the way is the default here for some reason, and that's where this mixer view comes in handy. Hopefully I just missed it somewhere. Anyway, you go into Shift Instrument, find the reverb send, remove that here. Okay, and find that for the snare drum as well. And now we're just automating it for the hi-hats. By the way, if you want to change parameters quickly, you can just hold Shift and change them quickly like that. So that's pretty much how you sequence here. In addition to the 8 variations, you can also sequence 2 separate fills per pattern. And there's also a automated fill function called scatter, which is interesting. And it also has a few parameters. In terms of available tones or sounds, they're both the same, and there are hundreds of available tones, dozens of analog modeling and FM synths. Yeah, we can just go through these really briefly. If I press instrument, yeah, so if you see P, that's a analog modeling preset. And we can just remove the reverb for the sake of this so we can hear it more clearly. Anyway, so that's P. F is the FM sounds. We heard some of these. So we're in the tom section, and S means sample. So these are sample-based toms. And yeah, that goes, you know, on and on. FM sounds again. Sample-based claps. Yeah, hats. One interesting thing, if I find a sound that has that, I'll just fast forward through this. So some sounds have this slash, which means there are 2 sounds for that slot. One that you can hear by pressing the sound like this, and another, if you hold the instrument button, you can hear the secondary sound. So there are a few of these, and for the FM sounds, this also pitches it. So it's a nice little touch. So maybe look for a different FM sound. Cowbell, of course. Beat tuned cowbell. So the FM sounds have variations, which is nice. Yeah, we won't go through all of these. That's just a sampling of the samples. And so all these are preset samples. And then if you scroll from the beginning all the way left, and we can use Shift to do that quickly, then you have access counterclockwise to user samples. So you can load these up using the SD card. And you know, I was trash talking samples, but they pitch nicely as well. It's just a very different effect than a synth pitching. They slow down, but that doesn't make them bad. Okay, so that's the on-panel stuff, more or less. Let's take a look at some of the things that you can access if you're willing to dive a little bit deeper into the menus. This is identical on both. There are kit parameters and instrument parameters. Shift Kit will show us the kit parameters, overall level, reverb type and other parameters, delay type and other parameters, and the master effect. There are a few master effects that you can choose from. Yeah, we won't go through all of these. So that's the master effect. And the next category is external input, sidechain, and other parameters. Again, there aren't really any external inputs here. It's only audio coming in through USB. I'm not sure how practical that is, but it's there. The LFO, each kit has one LFO. You choose its shape once for all of the different instruments, but then, and we'll see this later in the instrument menu, you can choose what that LFO does. So one LFO shape per kit, and there are a few options here. Sample and hold is a random LFO, and you can either tempo sync it or set its rate manually. Anyway, mutes. Oh, I didn't talk about mutes. There's a dedicated mute button here, so that's easy. If you want to mute any of the instruments, you hold Shift, and that doesn't work in instrument record mode, TR-8. Hold Shift and mute any tracks that you want. So that's mute. You can see that sort of the color goes out. Anyway, back to the kit parameters. So that's the mutes, control, what this does, and color. So if you're bored with these colors, you can change them up a bit. And name, yeah, that's pretty much it for kit parameters. So that's global for the kit. If we go ahead into the instrument parameters, you've got a reverb send, and that again is per instrument, obviously like everything else in the instrument parameters. LFO destination, okay, so we have one LFO, but it can change different things. And these are the destinations you can choose for the LFO, which is pretty nice. Then you've got LFO depth, which is individual against per track. And did I mention that you can see that over here in the mixer? Good thing I have this plant here. LFO depth. So we really need this mixer view over here, guys. Yeah, and how embarrassing would it be if I just missed that as a shift function? Anyway, effect. So each instrument gets its own effect, and this is what you can choose from. So a few nice options there. Then when you choose an effect, you get the different parameters for that effect. And I think that's it for the instrument menu. And then let's not forget samples. If you load up a user sample, so let's just do that, and then go into Shift here, you can edit the start and end point of the sample. Obviously, there's no graphic interface here, and editing these numbers is kind of a hassle. You can do that with Shift, but you can feel your way around this if you want to chop off a sample here. Okay, so that's the 6S and a comparison to the 8S. Let's take a look at these two and see what the difference between them is. The MC-101 and the TR-6S are in a very similar form factor, and at least as of now, they cost the same. So I'm sure the question's going to come up, which of these two should you get? They're both battery and USB powered. They both make music. So what's the difference? Now, I already covered the MC-101 in depth, and I'll point to that video below. But in general, while it may seem like the MC-101 is a slouch with only 4 tracks compared to 6 tracks on the 6S, in fact, the MC-101 has quite a few pros compared to the 6S. First, the MC-101 is a full-blown polyphonic groove box. So yeah, it only has 4 tracks, but each of these tracks is polyphonic, meaning it can play a few notes at once, as opposed to the 6S's tracks, which can only play one note at a time or one sound at a time. Beyond that, if you make a track a drum kit, then a single track on the MC-101 can contain up to 16 different sounds playing together at once. So this is track 1, it's got a drum kit on it, and every single pad is a different drum. Now, while this does have the Zencore synth for the bass and pad and melodic tracks, the drum tracks only play back samples. They can't use the synth engine. The 101, aside from being polyphonic on a per track basis, is also better suited towards programming melodies and certainly chords. So over here, you've got a fine-tune knob, and for the samples and for some of the FM synths, you also have coarse tuning control. So you can program melodies sort of semitone by semitone, step by step, but it's not exactly a pleasurable process. Over here, if I take one of the melodic tracks, you get notes like this, so it's very clear to see what you're playing. And this is a monophonic track, but this is polyphonic, so you can play chords as well on a single track. Finally, while the 6S has hundreds of tone presets, the MC-101 has thousands of them. It's based on Roland's new Zencore platform, which means it has a powerful built-in synth that's based on 4 simultaneous partials, basically up to 4 little mini synths that are layered one on top of the other. You don't exactly get access to all of its parameters like the 101's bigger brother, the 707, but you get access to some of those parameters, and you can choose any one of the same thousands of presets. Yeah, and these presets are in a bunch of categories, as you can see. As you can see here. These are just the categories. If we dive in, say, to the electric organ presets, there are a bunch of options here, all playable polyphonically and with a piano-like keyboard. So that's quite a handful of pros for the MC-101. What the 6S has that the MC-101 doesn't are the ACB models for Roland's classic drum synths and over 50 FM based drum and synth sounds. It's also slightly easier to sequence it TR style because you can choose the track you want to sequence and then see what's going on down here and sequence it. Here you've got to flip between 2 pages, so maybe if I go back to the drum kit, it'll be easier to show this. You sort of have to flip between the 2. So if I want to, say, sequence my kicks, I go into sequence, then I could change them. And then if I wanted to edit something else, I need to go back here. I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's an extra step. Not anything unreasonable. Let's add a few of these. So really, I think the main reason someone would want the 6S is the drum synths, both the virtual analog emulations, if you want access to things that sound very much like Roland's classic drum machines, or the wild FM tones that the engine here can create. While the MC-101 is based on the Zencore synth, it's not oriented or focused on creating percussive FM sounds anywhere near this. So that's it for the overview of all of these. One more thing before we head out to the pros and cons. I recently reviewed the TR-8S and included a bunch of performance tips and tricks. All of them are applicable to the 6S, so do check out that video if you're interested in further digging into what the 6S can do. So what are the pros and cons for the 6S overall? I think it's very similar to what I just mentioned about the MC-101. If you're just interested in a drum machine that can play samples, there are other options, but if you're interested in a drum machine with dozens of drum synth engines, both virtual analog based on Roland's classics and FM, this is pretty much the only game in town. The only alternative that I know that comes close both in terms of price and FM synthesis capabilities is Elektron's Model Cycles. It also has 6 monophonic tracks, and obviously a full pros and cons comparison would require another video, but in general, Model Cycles is better suited for playing FM melodically, and it also has a neat FM chords function, but it doesn't have as many FM synth machines, nor can it play samples or has a virtual analog engine tailored for Roland's classics, of course. Again, there are plenty of other differences, so I'll refer you to that video in the description for the full picture. Other than that, I can't think of any other drum machine with the timbral scope this broad at this price. If you can, leave a comment below, and if you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the FM bell below to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.